I didn't see you there. Well, today we're going to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird. We're going to be starting in chapter 24. Now, hopefully you have been doing your reading and you know what's been going on in the book. But just to recap, in the previous chapter, we had Aunt Alexandra talking to Scout about Walter Cunningham, where she basically told Scout that he's trash and would always be trash, no matter how you dress him up. Scout was quite upset and Jem comforted her. And we're moving from Jem comforting her and them having the discussion of Boo Radley into chapter 24. We are on page 305. Calpurnia wore her stiffest starched apron. She carried a tray of Charlotte. That's a baked good. She backed up to the swinging door and pressed it gently. I admired the ease and grace with which she handled heavy loads of dainty things. So did Aunt Alexandra, I guess, because she had let Calpurnia serve today. August was on the brink of September. Dill would be leaving for Meridian tomorrow. Today he was off with Jem at Barker's Eddy. Jem had discovered with angry amazement that nobody had ever bothered to teach Dill how to swim, a skill Jem considered necessary as walking. They had spent 2 afternoons at the creek. They said they were going in naked and I couldn't come, so I divided the lonely hours between Calpurnia and Miss Maudie. Today, Aunt Alexandra and her missionary circle were fighting the good fight all over the house. From the kitchen, I heard Miss Grace Merriweather giving a report in the living room on the squalid lives of the Marunas. It sounded like to me. They put the women out in huts when their time came, whatever that was. Either birth or the time of the month. They had no sense of family. I knew that distressed Auntie. They subjected children to terrible ordeals when they were 13. They were crawling with yaws and earworms. They chewed up and spat out of the bark of a tree into a communal pot, and the men got drunk on it. Immediately thereafter, the ladies adjourned for refreshments. I didn't know whether to go into the dining room or stay out. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments. It was not necessary that I attend the business part of the meeting. She said it bore me. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat, and reflected that if I spilled anything, Calpurnia would have to wash my dress again for tomorrow. This had been a busy day for her. I decided to stay out. "Can I help you, Cal?" I asked, wishing to be of some service. Calpurnia paused in the doorway. "You be still as a mouse in that corner," she said, "and you can help me load up the trays when I come back." The gentle hum of ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. "Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte. Just lovely. I can never get my crust like this, never can. Who would have thought of a little dewberry tarts? Calpurnia? Who'd have thought it? Anybody tell you that the preacher's wife?" "No. Well, she is, and that other one's not walking yet." They became quiet, and I knew they had all been served. Calpurnia returned and put my mother's heavy silver pitch on a tray. "This coffee's pitch, a curiosity," she murmured. "They don't make 'em like these days. Can I carry it in?" "If you be careful and don't drop it. Set it down at the end of the table by Miss Alexandra. Down there, by the cups and things. She's gonna pour." I tried pressing my behind against the door as Calpurnia had done, but the door didn't budge. Grinning, she held it open for me. "Careful now, it's heavy. Don't look at it, and you won't spill it." My journey was successful. Aunt Alexandra smiled brilliantly. "Stay with us, Jean Louise," she said. This was a part of her campaign to teach me to be a lady. Now, we all know that Scout is not what Aunt Alexandra wants as a lady. She's very much a tomboy, but Aunt Alexandra is still really pushing to try and turn Scout into the typical Southern woman. It was customary for every circle hostess to invite her neighbors in for refreshments, be they Baptists or Presbyterians, which accounted for the presence of Miss Rachel, sober as a judge, Miss Maudie, and Miss Stephanie Crawford. Rather nervous, I took a seat beside Miss Maudie and wondered why ladies put on their hats to go across the street. Remember, they're all dressed up in their Sunday best. They're wearing their fancy hats, wearing dresses. The older women are probably wearing corsets as well as the petticoats. Ladies in bunches always filled me with vague apprehension and a firm desire to be elsewhere. But this feeling was what Aunt Alexandra called being spoiled. The ladies were cool in fragile pastel prints. Most of them were heavily powdered but unrouged, so they didn't have blush on. The only lipstick in the room was Tangine Natural. Cutex Natural sparkled on their fingernails, but some of the younger ladies wore rose. They smelled heavenly. I sat quietly, having conquered my hands by tightly gripping the arms of the chair, and waited for someone to speak to me. Miss Maudie's gold bridgework twinkled. "You're mighty dressed up, Miss Jean Louise," she said. "Where are your breeches today? So where are your pants?" "Under my dress." I hadn't meant to be funny, but the ladies laughed. My cheeks grew hot as I realized my mistake. But Miss Maudie looked gravely down at me. She never laughed at me unless I meant to be funny. In the sudden silence that followed, Miss Stephanie Crawford called from across the room. "What you going to be when you grow up, Jean Louise?" "A lawyer." Remember, Miss Stephanie Crawford is our town gossip. She will try and get any information and even make up her own. "No, I hadn't thought about it," I answered, grateful that Miss Stephanie was kind enough to change the subject. Hurriedly, I began choosing my vocation. Nurse? Aviator? "Well, why shoot? I thought you'd wanted to be a lawyer. You've already commenced going to court." Because remember, Dill, Jem, and Scout were all at the courthouse for the hearing of Tom Robinson. Everyone saw them there. The ladies laughed again. "That Stephanie's a card," somebody said. Miss Stephanie was encouraged to pursue the subject. "Don't you want to grow up to be a lawyer?" Miss Maudie's hand touched mine, and I answered mildly enough. "No, just a lady." Miss Stephanie eyed me suspiciously, decided that I meant no impertinence, and contented herself with, "Well, you won't get very far until you start wearing dresses more often." Miss Maudie's hand closed tightly on mine, and I said nothing. Its warmth was enough. Mrs. Grace Merriweather sat on my left, and I felt it would be polite to talk to her. Mr. Merriweather, a faithful Methodist under duress, apparently saw nothing personal in singing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I will not subject you to my singing. It was the general opinion of Maycomb, however, that Mrs. Merriweather had sobered him up and made a reasonably useful citizen of him. For certainly, Mrs. Merriweather was the most devout lady in Maycomb, so she's very, very religious. I searched for a topic of interest to her. "What did you all study this afternoon?" I asked. "Oh, child, those poor Myrnas," she said, and was off. Few other questions would be necessary. Mrs. Merriweather's large brown eyes always filled with tears when she considered the oppressed. "Living in that jungle with nobody but J. Grimes Everett," she said. "Not a white person will go near him, but that saintly J. Grimes Everett." Mrs. Merriweather played her voice like an organ. Every word she said received its full measure. "The poverty, the darkness, the immorality, nobody but James Grimes Everett knows. You know, when the church gave me that trip to the campgrounds, J. Grimes Everett said to me—" "Was he there, ma'am?" I thought. "Home on leave. James Grimes Everett said to me, he said, 'Mrs. Merriweather, you have no conception of what we are fighting over here. That's what he said to me. Yes, ma'am, I said to him. Mr. Everett, I said, the ladies of Macomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church South are behind you 100%. That's what I said to him. And you know, right then and there, I made a pledge in my heart. I said to myself, when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Maronas and bring J. Grimes Everett's message to Macomb. And that's just what I'm doing. Yes, ma'am. When Mrs. Merriweather shook her head, her black curls jiggled. Jean Louise, she said, you're a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there's nothing but sin and squalor. Very dark times. Yes, ma'am. Sin and squalor. What was that, Gertrude? Said Mrs. Merriweather turned on her chimes for the lady sitting beside her. Oh, that. Well, I always say forgive and forget, forgive and forget. Thing that church ought to do is help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. Some of the men ought to go out there and tell the preacher to encourage her. So, Christian town, Christian life. Mrs. Merriweather is talking about someone needs to go send the preacher to a certain woman with kids. We can assume that that woman is Helen. Excuse me, Mrs. Merriweather, I interrupted. Are you all talking about Mayella Yule? Because again, the Yules are not the most Christian or religious in town. No, child. That darkie's wife. Tom's wife. Tom Robinson, ma'am. Mrs. Merriweather turned back to her neighbor. There's one thing I truly believe, Gertrude, she continued, but some people just don't see it my way. If we just let them know we forgive them, that we've forgotten it, this whole thing will blow over. So as you can see, Miss Merriweather, very racist, not the most outstanding person, very narrow-minded when it comes to things like this. She can talk all she wants about empathizing with the squalor and the sin of the Maronas, but when it comes to actually looking at things around her, she's very oblivious. Mrs. Merriweather, I interrupted once more. What'll blow over? Again she turned to me. Mrs. Merriweather was one of those childless adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone of voice when speaking to children. Nothing, Jean Louise, she said in a stately largo. The cooks and field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after that trial, because Tom Robinson was found guilty even though he was innocent. Mrs. Merriweather faced Mrs. Farrow. Gertrude, I tell you there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their mouths go down to here. Just ruins your day to have one of them in the kitchen. You know what I said to my Sophie, Gertrude? I said, Sophie, I said, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining. And you know, it did her good. She took her eyes off that floor and said, No, Miss Merriweather, Jesus never went around grumbling. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity to go by to witness for the Lord. Again, Mrs. Merriweather, not the best of women. Oh, hello, Stanley. That is my cat, if you can see him. Mrs. Merriweather is trying to preach or give the lore to Sophie, who would be a servant in her home or a hired help. And she was basically telling her, oh, you shouldn't feel bad about the death of Tom Robinson. You shouldn't feel bad, or not the death. You shouldn't feel bad about Tom Robinson being guilty of this. You know, Jesus never was going around grumbling. But Sophie is a black woman in a white household in Jim Crow segregation, Alabama in 1935. She cannot give her opinion to Miss Merriweather without losing her job that she needs. So of course she is going to say, "You're right, ma'am. I hear you, ma'am. Yes, about Jesus, ma'am." So she's going along with it. I was reminded of the ancient little organ in the chapel at Finch's Landing. When I was very small, and if I had been very good during the day, Atticus would let me pump its bellows while he picked out a tune with one finger. The last note would linger as long as there was air to sustain it. Mrs. Merriweather had run out of air. I judged and was replenishing her supply while Mrs. Farrow composed herself to speak. Mrs. Farrow was a splendidly built woman with pale eyes and narrow feet. She had a fresh, permanent wave, and her hair was a mass of tight gray ringlets, so curls. She was the second most devout lady in Maycomb. She had a curious habit of prefacing everything she said with a soft, sibilant sound. Oh, hello. So we have a guest. This is Stanley. He will be reading with us. Hello, sir. Okay. Hello. Good boy. Grace, she said. "It's just like I was telling Brother Hudson the other day. Brother Hudson," I said, "looks like we're fighting a losing battle. A losing battle," I said. "It doesn't matter to 'em one bit. We can educate 'em till we're blue in the face. We can till we drop to make Christians out of 'em. But there's no lady safe in her bed these nights," he said to me. "Mrs. Farrow, I don't know what we're coming down here." I told him that was certainly a fact. So they're basically saying, oh, you can try and make them Christians, but no woman is safe. Because again, Tom Robinson was found guilty of raping Mayella, even though we all know he did no such thing. So here's these women being like, "Oh, we aren't safe in our beds at night. Oh," when that's completely untrue. Mrs. Merriweather nodded wisely. Her voice soared over the clink of coffee cups and the soft bovine sounds of the ladies munching their dainties. So bovine is cow. "Gertrude," she said, "I tell you there are some good but misguided people in this town. Good but misguided. Folks in this town who think they're doing right, I mean. Now, far be it from me to say who, but some of them in this town thought they were doing the right thing a while back, but all they did was stir 'em up. We know oh, they're trying to be good, is Atticus. So she's like, I don't want to say who it is, but we're sitting in their home right now. That's all they did. Might have looked like the right thing to do at the time, I'm sure. I don't know. I'm not read in that field, but sulky, dissatisfied. I'll tell you, if my Sophie kept it up another day, I'd have let her go. It never entered the wool of hers that the only reason I keep her is because the depression's on and she needs her $1.25 every week she can get." So basically, if Sophie, who works for Mrs. Merriweather, had continued to be upset, as she should be, about Tom Robinson's case, Mrs. Merriweather is like, well, I would have just fired her. But it's the depression and she needs her $1.25, which is not much money at all. "His food doesn't stick going down, does it?" So here's Miss Maudie interrupting. Miss Maudie said it. 2 tight lines had appeared at the corner of her mouth, so she's most likely frowning or pursing her lips. She had been sitting silently beside me, her coffee cup balanced on one knee. I had lost the thread of conversation long ago, when they had quit talking about Tom Robinson's wife, and had contented myself with thinking of Finch's Landing and the river. Aunt Alexandra had got it backwards. The business part of the meeting was blood-curdling. The social hour was dreary. Maudie, I'm sure I don't know what you mean, said Mrs. Merriweather. I'm sure you do, Miss Maudie said shortly. She said no more. When Miss Maudie was angry, her brevity was icy, so her manner of speaking. Something had made her deeply angry, and her gray eyes were as cold as her voice. Mrs. Merriweather reddened, glanced at me, and looked away. I could not see Mrs. Farrow. Because again, these women are talking about Scout's father in front of her, kind of bringing him down. And Miss Maudie's not going to have that. And Miss Maudie is very sharp. Not only in the mind, but also with her words. You do not want to fight Miss Maudie with words. She will tear you down, as she's doing with these ladies. Aunt Alexandra got up from the table and swiftly passed more refreshments, neatly engaging Mrs. Merriweather and Mrs. Gates in brisk conversation. When she had them well on the road with Mrs. Perkins, Aunt Alexandra stepped back. She gave Miss Maudie a look of pure gratitude. And I wondered at the world of women. Miss Maudie and Aunt Alexandra had never been especially close, and here was Auntie silently thanking her for something. For what, I knew not. I was content to learn that Aunt Alexandra could be pierced sufficiently to feel gratitude for help given. There is no doubt about it. I must soon enter this world, where on its surface fragrant ladies rocked slowly, fanned gently, and drank cool water. So Miss Maudie helped the reputation of the Finch family just now. Here was Miss Merriweather and Mrs. Farrow kind of bashing on Atticus. Miss Maudie stops it, and Aunt Alexandra gives a slight nod of gratitude towards her for defending Atticus when she cannot. So Aunt Alexandra is very grateful for the help. But I was more at home in my father's world. People like Mr. Hecate did not trap you with innocent questions to make fun of you. Even Jem was not highly critical unless you said something stupid. Ladies seemed to live in faint horror of men, seemed unwilling to approve wholeheartedly of them. But I liked them. There was something about them, no matter how much they cussed and drank and gambled and chewed, no matter how undelectable they were. There was something about them that I instinctively liked. They weren't hypocrites, Mrs. Perkins, born hypocrites. Yes, that was planned in this book. Mrs. Merriweather was saying, at least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there set 'em free, but you don't see 'em setting at the table with 'em. At least we don't have the deceit to say to 'em, yes, you're as good as we are, but stay away from us. Down here we just say, you live your way and we'll live ours. I think that women, that Mrs. Roosevelt, lost her mind. Just plain lost her mind coming down to Birmingham and trying to sit with them. If I was the mayor of Birmingham, I'd... So again, Miss Merriweather continues her wonderful viewpoints of stating that, oh, well, at least here in the South, we don't try and say like, oh, you're one of us, you're free, we're similar. And then don't let them sit at the table. They're like, you stay there, we'll be here. We'll live two separate worlds. Again, racist views in a racist town. Well, neither of us was the mayor of Birmingham, but I wished I was the governor of Alabama for one day. I'd let Tom Robinson go so quickly the missionary society wouldn't have the time to catch its breath. Calpurnia was telling Mrs. Rachel's cook the other day how bad Tom was taking things, and she didn't stop talking when I came into the kitchen. She said there wasn't a thing Atticus could do to make him being shut up easier for him. So again, because remember, Tom Robinson was guilty and he's now in a prison. The last thing he said to Atticus before they took him down to the prison camp was, "Goodbye, Mr. Finch. There ain't nothing you can do now, so there ain't no use trying." Calpurnia said Atticus told her that day they took Tom to prison, he just gave up hope. She said Atticus tried to explain things to him, and that he must do his best not to lose hope because Atticus was doing his best to get him free. Miss Rachel's cook asked Calpurnia, why didn't Atticus just say, yes, you'll go free, and leave it at that? It seemed like that'd be a big comfort to Tom. Calpurnia said, because you ain't familiar with the law. First thing you learn when you're in a lawn family is that there ain't any definite answers to anything. Mr. Finch couldn't say something, so when he doesn't know for sure, it's so. So basically, Atticus isn't saying, yeah, you're gonna be free, because things can go either way, and he doesn't want to give false hope. And that's what Calpurnia is telling Miss Rachel's cook. The front door slammed, and I heard Atticus's footsteps in the hall. Automatically, I wondered what time it was. Not nearly time for him to be home. And on missionary society days, he usually stayed downtown until black dark. He stood in the doorway. His hat was in his hand, and his face was white. Excuse me, ladies, he said. Go right ahead with your meeting. Don't let me disturb you. Alexandra, could you come to the kitchen a minute? I want to borrow Calpurnia for a while. He didn't go through the dining room, but went down the back hallway and entered the kitchen from the rear door. Aunt Alexandra and I met him. The dining room door opened again, and Miss Maudie joined us. Calpurnia had risen from her chair. Cal, Atticus said, I want you to go with me out to Helen Robinson's house. What's the matter? Aunt Alexandra asked, alarmed by the look on my father's face. Tom's dead. Aunt Alexandra put her hands to her mouth. They shot him, said Atticus. He was running. It was during their exercise period. They said he just broke into a blind, raving charge at the fence and started climbing over, right in front of them. Didn't they try to stop him? Didn't they give him any warning? Aunt Alexandra's voice shook. Oh, yes. The guards called to him to stop. They fired a few shots in the air, then to kill. They got him just as he went over the fence. They said if he had 2 good arms, he'd have made it. He was moving that fast. 17 bullets in him. They didn't have to shoot him that much. Cal, I want you to come out with me and help me tell Helen. Yes, sir, she murmured, fumbling at her apron. Miss Maudie went to Calpurnia and untied it. So yes, Tom Robinson is dead. He decided he couldn't take the risk and tried to break free. And in doing so, he was shot 17 times. This is the last straw, Atticus, Aunt Alexandra said. Depends how you look at it, he said. What was one Negro, more or less, among 200 of them? He wasn't Tom to them. He was an escaping prisoner. Atticus leaned against the refrigerator, pushed up his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. We had such a good chance, he said. I told him what I thought, but I couldn't in truth say that we had more than a good chance. I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. Ready, Cal? Yes, sir, Mr. Finch. Then let's go. Aunt Alexandra sat down in Calpurnia's chair and put her hands to her face. She sat quite still. She was so quiet, I wondered if she would faint. Thank you for that. I heard Miss Maudie breathing as if she had just climbed the steps, and in the dining room, the ladies chattered happily. I thought Aunt Alexandra was crying. Stanley. Sir. Yes, I know. I thought Aunt Alexandra was crying, but when she took her hands away from her face, she was not. She looked weary. She spoke and her voice was flat. Don't you dare, sir. No! Stanley! Stanley! No! Cat! We are experiencing technical difficulties. So we're back from technical difficulties. I thought Aunt Alexandra was crying, but when she took her hands away from her face, she was not. She looked weary. She spoke and her voice was flat. I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie, but he's my brother, and I just want to know when this will ever end. Her voice rose. It tears him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears him to pieces. I've seen him win. What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else? So what else does the town want from him? What else can they take from him? This case has already taken a lot from him, and Aunt Alexandra's just like, what more can they do? What does who want, Alexandra? Miss Maudie asked. I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him do what they're afraid to do to themselves. It might lose them a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do. Be quiet. They'll hear you, said Miss Maudie. Have you ever thought of it this way, Alexandra? Whether Maycomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay a man. We trust him to do right. It's that simple. Who? Aunt Alexandra never knew she was echoing her 12-year-old nephew. The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. The handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people with enough humility to think, when they look at a Negro, there but for the Lord's kindness am I. Miss Maudie's old crispness was returning. The handful of people in this town with a background. That's who they are. Miss Maudie used a nice little trick right there. Her rhetoric's pretty good, especially at the end, appealing to the background. So she's saying that Atticus is helping all of these people. He is standing up for these people, but also for those with background, because Aunt Alexandra is obsessed with what? Her background, and the background of the family, and the whole history of it. So Miss Maudie right here is appealing towards Aunt Alexandra's kind of background superiority that she likes to keep. So she's like, those who have background, that's who he's also helping. Had I been attentive, I would have had another scrap to add to Jem's definition of background, but I found myself shaking and couldn't stop. I had seen Enfield Prison Farm, and Atticus had pointed out the exercise yard to me. It was the size of a football field. Stop that shaking, commanded Miss Maudie, and I stopped. Get up, Alexandra. We've left him long enough. So they have to go back to being the put-together ladies. Put on that mask, put on the facade of being all together and nothing is wrong in the world. Aunt Alexandra rose and smoothed the various whalebone ridges along her hips. She took her handkerchief from her belt and wiped her nose. She patted her hair and said, Do I show it? Not a sign, said Miss Maudie. Are you together again, Jean Louise? Yes, ma'am. Then let's join the ladies, she said grimly. Their voices swelled when Miss Maudie opened the door to the dining room. Aunt Alexandra was ahead of me, and I saw her head go up as she went through the door. Oh, Mrs. Perkins, she said, you need some more coffee. Let me get it. Calpurnia is on an errand for a few minutes, Grace, said Miss Maudie. Let me pass you some more of those dewberry tarts. Did you hear what that cousin of mine did the other day, the one who likes to go fishing? And so they went down the row of laughing women around the dining room, refilling coffee cups, dishing out goodies, as though their only regret was the temporary domestic disaster of losing Calpurnia. The gentle hum began again. Yes, Mrs. Perkins, that J. Grimes Everett is a martyred saint. He needed to get married, so then they ran. to the beauty parlor every Saturday afternoon. Soon as the sun goes down, he goes to bed with a chicken's a crate full of sick chickens. Fred says that's what started it all. Fred says. So these are just snippets of all the conversations that they're trying to use to distract the women and make sure the other ladies don't know what's occurring. Aunt Alexandra looked across the room at me and smiled. She looked at a tray of cookies on the table and nodded at them. I carefully picked up the tray and watched myself walk to Mrs. Merriweather. With my best company manners, I asked her if she would have some. After all, if Auntie could be a lady at a time like this, so could I. That is the end of chapter 24. In the next video, I will read to you chapter 25. So yes, in this chapter we had tea time with Aunt Alexandra, Miss Maudie, and the other ladies of Maycomb. We learned of Tom Robinson's death. And we also saw that Scout is more receptive to being a lady, and she learned a little bit more about what that means. Well, I will see you next time. I hope everyone is doing well, and maybe in the next video, my other cat will show up. Bye!